While millions of people are posting family first and tagging their relatives in birthday tributes, there's a growing group of people who have quietly made one of the hardest decisions a human being can make. They chose peace. They walked away from their family. And psychology says they might be the most self-aware people in the room. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see estrangement and maybe how you see yourself. Here's what nobody tells you. Cutting off a family member isn't something people do easily. It isn't dramatic. It isn't selfish. And it almost never happens overnight. It's usually the final act of someone who tried everything else first. And roughly 68 million Americans are doing it right now. That's not a fringe behavior. That's a quiet epidemic hiding behind every happy family photo on the internet. So, what's actually going on? Let's start with the science, because this is where it gets fascinating. In the 1970s, psychiatrist Murray Bowen developed what he called family systems theory. And inside that framework, he identified a specific psychological behavior he named emotional cutoff. His definition was precise. It's what happens when the emotional intensity inside a family system becomes so overwhelming that a person's only available tool for surviving it is distance. Physical, emotional, or both. Here's the wild part. Bowen didn't frame cutoff as healing. He framed it as a symptom, a signal that the unresolved emotional charge between a parent and child has reached a level the nervous system can no longer manage through proximity. The person doesn't leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they care so much, and for so long, that staying started costing them their health, their identity, their sense of reality. Think about that for a second. The people who look the coldest are often the ones who felt the most. But there's a paradox buried in Bowen's research that almost nobody talks about. He found that simply leaving doesn't resolve the wound. People who cut off without doing the deeper emotional work tend to leak those same family dynamics into their new relationships. They marry versions of their parents. They recreate the same hierarchies at work. They overreact in ways that confuse their partners. Physical distance and emotional freedom are not the same thing. You can move 3,000 miles away and still be completely controlled by a relationship you swore you left behind. So, why are more people making this choice now than ever before? Because the cultural story around family has fundamentally changed. In previous generations, family wasn't optional. It was an economic unit, a survival structure. You didn't set boundaries with the people you needed to survive the winter. But modern psychology and modern financial independence created something new. The idea that family is a voluntary emotional relationship, and that if it consistently harms you, you are allowed to leave it. Sociologist Joshua Coleman has studied this shift for decades. He points out that today's adult children are far more likely to evaluate their parents through a psychological lens. Words like narcissistic, toxic, and emotionally unavailable have entered everyday language. And once someone applies that framework to their parent, the modern cultural script is clear. Protect yourself. Go no contact. Call it self-care. That shift is real. But here's something researchers also found, and this part is important. The parents being cut off are almost universally blindsided. They describe it as coming out of nowhere. But the adult children, they almost always say they tried to communicate their pain for years before going silent. What looks like a sudden disappearance from the outside is usually the last page of a very long book. And that gap between the parent who didn't see it coming and the child who felt invisible for decades, that gap is where most estrangements live permanently unresolved. Now, here's where it gets psychologically complex, because the person who walks away doesn't just find freedom. They find something far more complicated. Researchers call it ambiguous loss. It's a specific form of grief, and in some ways it's the hardest kind, because there's no funeral. The person is alive. They exist somewhere. You could theoretically call them, but the relationship is gone, and there's no social ritual for mourning that. No casseroles, no condolence cards, just a silence that other people don't know how to hold with you. The early stage often brings genuine relief, a reduction in anxiety that can feel almost physical, like putting down something heavy you'd been carrying for so long, you forgot it wasn't part of your body. Psychologists call this the honeymoon phase of estrangement. The nervous system finally exhales, but it rarely stays that clean. What follows is often a slow cycling grief, guilt that surfaces on holidays, a strange longing that has nowhere to go, anger at having to grieve something you chose, and on top of all of that, judgment from the outside world. But they're your parents. Life is short. You only get one family. People who have chosen estrangement hear these phrases constantly, and because they can't quickly summarize a decade of emotional damage into a polite dinner party explanation, many of them stop talking about it altogether. They become quietly isolated, not from their family, but from anyone who might ask about it. Some develop what psychologists call hyper-autonomy. To prove to themselves and the world that they don't need the people they left, they become aggressively self-sufficient. They struggle to accept help. They flinch at vulnerability. Independence becomes armor. And the irony? That's just another form of the relationship controlling them from a distance. Now, flip it around, because the person who gets cut off is living inside a completely different kind of pain. For a parent who has been estranged by their adult child, the psychological experience is often described as a kind of social death. Being rejected by your child carries a specific shame that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It signals to the parent and to the world a fundamental failure at the most basic human role. Many parents suffer in complete silence, too ashamed to tell friends who seem to have warm, functional families. And here's where the research lands a difficult truth. The parents most likely to remain estranged are the ones least able to acknowledge their role in it. Not because they're monsters, but because the psychological cost of that acknowledgement is enormous. Accepting that you caused your child enough pain to permanently disappear requires dismantling a self-image that took a lifetime to build. Many people simply cannot do it. Without that kernel of acknowledgement, reconciliation has almost nowhere to begin. And the damage doesn't stop at two people. Estrangement moves through families like a fault line. Grandchildren lose entire branches of their heritage cousins, traditions, stories, roots. Siblings are forced to choose sides in a conflict they may not even fully understand. And the sibling bond itself often doesn't survive the pressure. What begins as a dyadic break between two people can quietly collapse an entire family structure within a generation. So, what do we do with all of this? Here's the honest answer psychology keeps arriving at. There is no clean version of estrangement. Not for the person who leaves, not for the person who gets left, not for anyone caught between them. It is a decision made under enormous pressure by people who have usually tried everything else, and it comes with costs that last a long time. But here's what's also true. Choosing psychological survival over social obligation is not the same as not loving someone. Sometimes it is because you love them, and because you have finally accepted that love alone cannot make a relationship safe. The 68 million people who have made this choice aren't cold. They're not broken. They're not giving up. They're people who finally stopped waiting for a relationship to become something it had never been. And for a lot of them, that decision, as painful as it is, was the first truly autonomous choice they ever made. You're not wrong for needing peace, and you're not wrong for missing the family you wished you'd had. Both of those things are allowed to be true at the same time. If this resonated with you, you're probably going to understand exactly why quiet people are actually processing the world at a completely different depth than everyone else, and why that might be the most underrated advantage in the room. Click this video to find out why you think differently than the crowd. I'll see you in the next one.